Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the performance of Joonas Donskoi, number 27. Now, of course, Joonas Donskoi is one of the Sharks who did leave in the off-season, joining players like Joe Pavelski and Gustav Nyquist. Donskoi signed with the Colorado Avalanche on a pretty significant deal, about 4 years, for just about $4 million, something the Sharks definitely could not afford with how this off-season went for them. Now, Donskoi spent a lot of time bouncing around the lineups. There were times where you could find him on the first line even, and yet there were also times you could consistently find him on the fourth line. However, his most frequent line mates for the season were Evander Kane and Tomas Hertl in both the regular season and in the playoffs. For his stats in the regular season, he ended up with 80 games played, actually only missing a couple due to healthy scratch, I believe. 14 goals, 23 assists for 37 points. A plus 10 was actually quite solid for Donskoi, as well as 3 power play points. Now, of course, Donskoi did have a spot on the power play prior to the arrival of Gustav Nyquist, since the first unit normally had LeBanc, Pavelski, Couture, and Hertl, and then the second unit was Kane, Thornton, Meyer, and then Donskoi. But once Nyquist came, that sort of switched it out. So 3 power play points looks quite bad, but isn't terrible for Donskoi. His time on ice was 13 minutes and 25 seconds, a decent amount of that being even strength. As I said, he only got about 30-ish seconds of power play time. I suspect if the Sharks didn't pick up Gustav Nyquist, Donskoi would have clocked in at around 50 or so seconds, and it basically contains 0 shorthanded ice time. So Donskoi is still an even strength player who the Sharks relied on somewhat. He was right behind everyone in the top 6, as well as behind Joe Thornton for even strength ice time, but he was ahead of the likes of Sorensen and Kevin LeBanc, as you'd expect for Donskoi, who did get a good amount of time on the second line, as you could see there. So it was a regular season that was okay for Donskoi, but it was mostly just the status quo. A lot of people were hoping for much bigger and better things for Joonas Donskoi. His rookie season, the year the Sharks made it to the Stanley Cup Finals, he showed a lot of promise. Then the following year wasn't great, but this past season, prior to the 17-18 season, he showed some promise again, getting about 32 points, but in 16 less games than 82, and yet this season he took no step forward, and he basically just remained stagnant. And he also showed his immense inconsistency, where about in December or January he had a nice hot streak where he had 7 goals in, I believe, as that many games, but then he went just about 40 games in a row before scoring a game winner in Game 7 against the Avalanche in the playoffs. So just a massive cold streak for Joonas Donskoi, and it was something that really plagued his whole time with the Sharks, is just how inconsistent he could find himself. Now, in the playoffs, Donskoi did miss 8 games, most due to injury, but also a couple times healthy scratched, especially early on in the Vegas series when everyone was healthy for the Sharks, or everyone was in the lineup for the Sharks, and Michael Haley got a couple of times over Donskoi. And so he only played 12 games, 1 goal and 2 assists for his 3 points. That was a +1, not terrible for Donskoi in terms of a plus-minus. 0 power play points, as you'd mostly expect. As I said, that Nyquist was there, so Donskoi didn't get much power play time, but his time on ice fell a good minute. And of course, you could explain this by a few seconds here or there for the power play time. However, that is evened out by the fact that he actually got a decent amount of short-handed ice time in these playoffs, going from about 3 or 4 seconds in the regular season to closer to about 30 seconds in the playoffs. And so it was his even strength ice time that really took a fall, showing that DeBoer didn't really have much faith in Donskoi in any sort of defending role. And if you were to take out the big outliers of those playoff overtimes, for instance, in Game 6, he got close. In Game 6 against the Golden Knights, he got close to 20 minutes. In overtimes against the Avalanche and against the Blues, he also got some decent amount of times. There were a few games in these playoffs, 3 or 4 of them, where he didn't even get to the double digits in terms of time on ice, not even just in terms of even strength time on ice. So Donskoi had a lot of issues in the playoffs that didn't really reflect well on him. So while his frequent line mates were Kane, Hertl, and Donskoi even in the playoffs, his second most frequent line mates in the playoffs were Goodrow and Melker Karlsson. And so for his grades, first quarter, he gets a C+, then C's across the board for the second, third, and fourth quarter before the playoffs, where he gets a C-. And all of that does average out to the grade of a C, but I've decided to give Joonas Donskoi the grade of a C- for the season because, as I've said multiple times, the playoffs do have a bigger role, but also because, Donskoi was a player who was getting opportunities with Kane and Hurdle. Hurdle was likely the regular season forward MVP at the very least for the Sharks. Kane was no slouch himself with the good 30 goals, and yet Donskoi heavily lagged behind, and the massive amount of inconsistencies that were in Donskoi's games that allowed him to go from a second line forward to a fourth line forward basically at will just was tough to watch, and as such it wasn't really great season for Joonas Donskoi, and that could be a big reason why the Sharks didn't really push all too hard to try and re-sign him. Class dismissed.